مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في معظم أنحاء العالم الحملات الانتخابية قصيرة لا تتجاوز 6 أسابيع أو شهرين، بينما في أميركا تبدأ الحملة الانتخابية فور إحصاء أصوات الانتخابات التي قبلها، وبالرغم من الأعوام التي يكرسها المرشحون لجمع الأموال واستخدام المستشارين وإجراء استطلاعات الرأي ونشر الإعلانات في الإذاعة والتلفزيون والصحف ولقاء الناخبين، إلا أن الأسابيع القليلة الأخيرة هي في الغالب الأكثر أهمية. في فلوريدا على سبيل المثال كان وصول الإحصائيين هو الامتحان الأكبر بالنسبة للمرشحين الذي كانوا يجرؤون الحملات الانتخابية طوال الأعوام مضت. في جورجيا هناك مزاعم حديثة جدا بأن مرشحا جمهوريا محافظا دفع تكلفة عملية إجهاد لأشقائه السابقة. وفي بنسلفانيا هناك تقارير لمراسلين استقصائيين بأن جمهوري محافظ آخر وهو طبيب كذب على مستهلكين عندما أعطى ضمانة للدواء الحمية. كيف تؤثر هذه المفاجآت في الدقيقة الأخيرة على الانتخابات؟ هل اتخذ الناخبون قرارهم؟ للإلقاء نظرة على الأيام الأخيرة هذه قبل انتخابات نوفمبر، يسرني أن أستضيف صحفيين سياسيين لامعين، ديفيد دراكر وإلين غودفري. Welcome back to داخل Washington. We're in the final few weeks before our November election, less than a month to go, and candidates are making their final pitches to the electorates. These are Senate candidates in a third of the Senate seats and all 435 House of Representative candidates across the country. What is their final pitch about? How are they spending that last dollar in their campaign kitty? What are the key issues as we go right into our vote? I'm delighted to have Elaine Godfrey and David Drucker with us to talk about these important questions. All right, David, if you're a candidate for Senate or a candidate for House, how much money do you hope you still have in the bank to get you through the final month of a campaign?
Well, if you're a candidate for the U.S. Senate, you probably hope you have tens of millions of dollars in the bank to spend over the final weeks. And in fact, many of these candidates do. We've begun to see some of the fundraising reports for the late summer and early fall. And some of the Democratic candidates in particular have raised more than $20 million during that period. And so that's money in the bank or already being spent, and millions more is going to come in. If you're running for the House of Representatives, you may want a similar amount of money. You don't need quite the same amount of money. A good fundraising report for a candidate for the House of Representatives ranges anywhere from $500,000 to $5 million. And it just sort of depends on how competitive that race is. I think in the races that we are going to be focused on, the races that will determine which party controls the Senate majority in January, which party controls the House majority in January, those races are all going to have the money that they need, meaning the Democratic candidate and the groups supporting that candidate will have plenty of money and will spend it. And the Republican candidate and the groups supporting that candidate on the Republican side will have plenty of money and spend it. And then everything is going to come down to where voters are on issues and how the political winds, if you will, are blowing in terms of whether those crucial independent swing voters are more inclined to support Democrats or more inclined to support Republicans.
And Elaine, if you're a candidate with all this money, with a month to go, what do you think is the most effective way to spend it? Lots of different ways to advertise: television, radio, print, online, lots of other things to spend money on. How do you decide what's the best way to spend that money?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question. I think, I mean, this is the time when we see all the attack ads come out, right? Like the most vicious attacks on TV, online, I would say, maybe the most effective. Like in Pennsylvania, we've seen these attacks on John Fetterman sort of slowly trickling in through the summer, and now Dr. Oz is hitting John Fetterman, the Democrat, harder than we've seen before on TV mostly. So I guess any way you can sort of get your face, get your message, talk about these very specific, historical wins issues, right? Like rising crime, inflation for the Republicans. For Democrats, they're probably talking about abortion. They're talking about democracy. These are sort of this is the final squeeze, and they're trying to get those specific messages out there.
And David, can you put on your campaign strategist hat? If you have $1 to spend, what do you think is the most effective way generally to spend it?
So part of it depends on where in the country you're running and whether it's a House race or a Senate race. You definitely want to be investing money to meet with voters one-on-one, to send what we like to call, boots on the ground, volunteers who are supporting your campaign, to go knock on doors, check in with people who are already registered to vote. Are they inclined to vote for your candidate if they show up to vote? So you want to get to those voters and make sure that they vote or encourage them to vote. That costs money. You want to try and reach the independent voters that you think might vote for you. You want to knock on their door, call them on the telephone, send them an email. All of that costs money. But you do want to advertise. And in some of the larger states, television is the most effective way to reach people. In some of the smaller states, retail politics, meaning holding campaign rallies and events, going to restaurants where people are eating and just shaking hands. Those are very effective ways to acquire more votes. Even though we're getting close to Election Day, many races are still undecided. They are in play. And so as a candidate, you want to reach as many voters as you can. First, personally yourself, and secondarily through people who are supporting you. So one, broadcast your message via advertising. In some states and districts, it's television, and others, it may be through digital platforms. And then you want to do what we call get out the vote activities, meaning sending people door to door, or putting them on the phone, or having them email and send text to cell phones to encourage people inclined to vote for you to show up and actually vote.
So, Elaine, we saw recently what can only be called a major political stunt from the governor of Florida in arranging for the dispatch of groups of illegal migrants to the progressive liberal stronghold of Martha's Vineyard, which often doesn't receive a lot of economic migrants, illegal migrants. Do these sorts of things sway voters? Do they work? Or in this case, did it work against the governor of Florida?
I think that for people who that might be appealing, I sort of think they were already going to vote for Governor DeSantis in November. I don't really see that working. Maybe on the margins, maybe a little bit. I think what works, I think what could help DeSantis, although I think he sort of already had this election in the bag against Democrat Charlie Crist. I think what could help is this hurricane, his helping his constituents in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, him, shaking hands with the president, working together. But Joe Biden said yesterday, we worked hand in glove on this. And I think, it wasn't exactly like they were friends, or it was not really a warm welcome necessarily between the two when Biden went down to Florida. But I think that sort of is the kind of stuff that can sway independents, sway those swing voters.
These sorts of events are important tests of leadership. And in this case, we saw that DeSantis, who wants to project himself as sort of, Donald Trump with a bit more gravitas and experience, working with the Democratic president, Joe Biden. So is this good for DeSantis? Did he come across as a competent leader in a moment of crisis? And what does it mean for him to be shaking hands with Joe Biden?
Well, look, I think you have to say from the perspective of Ron DeSantis and his political future, so far, so good. As you mentioned, his way of governing is sort of Donald Trump with more finesse, or Donald Trump who's actually effective. And the number one rule of a natural disaster recovery in the United States from a political standpoint is that you work with anyone and everyone who you need to help your state or locality recover. And that means, as Joe Biden has said about Ron DeSantis, we don't agree on much politically, but the order of business here is to help Floridians recover. They're all Americans. We're all Americans. And I'm going to do everything I can to help Governor DeSantis help Florida. Governor DeSantis has responded in kind and was very visible with President Joe Biden in touring Florida and in working with him so far to aid in this recovery. That's exactly what voters want to see. Voters of both parties, even when they don't like the other political party or their leaders, really want to see that at a time when their homes have been destroyed and their lives have been put at risk. And it does help project this notion that you're not just a political actor, but that you're actually governing. And so I think over the long haul, if this is the image that persists around Governor DeSantis coming out of Hurricane Ian, it bodes well in the immediate for his reelection. As we've already said, he's favored to win reelection, and I don't think that was too much in doubt. This only helps that, but it also puts him in a good place to run for president in 2024 if that's something he chooses to do. And we should say that he's operating a little bit different than former President Donald Trump, who had a hard time getting along with his political adversaries when it was required, to his own political detriment. And that's something that so far Governor DeSantis does not seem to have a problem doing.
Yeah, actually, Elaine, we haven't heard much from the former president, even though the hurricane is in Florida, where he resides.
That's right. I mean, this is not exactly Trump's bag, right? This sort of statesmanship part of the job, this sort of magnanimous statements, getting along with your adversaries, just as David said. It's true, we haven't heard much from him. I also think, I mean, he's distracted, right? Donald Trump has a lot going on in his life right now. So I'm sure we'll be hearing more from him soon. And also, he's also on the trail. So he'll be in Arizona soon. He'll be in Pennsylvania again soon, I think, campaigning for a bunch of these candidates, Kerry Lake in Arizona. And he'll potentially be announcing his own bid for president. If he's doing it, he might announce after the midterm. So that's definitely something I've got my eye on.
Okay, when we come back after the break, I want to look at some of the other issues that candidates are focusing on in these final weeks, especially how they get out the vote and how they arrange to monitor the election, which has become a much bigger issue in the last couple of years. Again, back here in Dakhel, Washington. Scan Amazon for books on Donald Trump, and you can fill a shelf. Some are by acolytes, like his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, or his ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. Some are by unabashed critics, like his niece, Mary Trump, and his national security advisor, John Bolton. Taken in small doses, each has a role to play in filling in the picture of our former and still would-be president. But I'm excited about a new book published by the husband and wife team of Peter Baker, New York Times White House correspondent, and Susan Glasser, the New Yorker's Washington essayist. Their new book, The Divider, Trump in the White House, can be expected to be in the breed of outstanding, incisive, and insightful journalistic accounts. It will need to be read, along with Washington Post editor and Watergate alumnus Bob Woodward's books about the Trump presidency, and the book by Wall Street Journal's Gerald Seib and the New York Times's Maggie Haberman. Journalists rarely have the final word. That's the reserve of historians. But the best of them have the most useful early sketches to help us make sense of something we all lived through, but may not fully comprehend. Again, my guests today include Elaine Godfrey, Elaine is a politics reporter at The Atlantic, one of America's leading magazines of news and ideas. A native of Iowa, she has also written for Real Clear Politics and New York Magazine. Also joining us is David M. Drucker. David is the senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Previously, he served as senior editor of CQ Roll Call, an insider newspaper covering Capitol Hill, and as political reporter for the Los Angeles Daily News, covering politics in his home state of California. All right, you both come from different states, different parts of the country. I want to ask a couple of sort of system issues. And how do candidates, for example, focus on making sure that their likely voters even get registered to vote? Do they focus on this? Is this the job of the state political parties, the Democrats or the Republicans, somebody else? I mean, if people don't get registered, they can't vote and they can't choose their candidate. Elaine?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's all of those groups. I mean, the state political party, this is a huge thing for them, at least. I mean, in Iowa, the Iowa Democratic Party, Republican Party are all over voter registration. But the candidates are doing that themselves. They're sending people out from the campaign to remind people to vote. So typically how it works, you send someone out to register, register voters, check on unregistered voters, maybe a month before, probably earlier. You go back to remind them to vote. You go back many times. I've accompanied many canvassers on these trips for stories where you go back. Are you voting? Yes, I am. Thank you. You do this process again and again. Even on election day and in once the in-person early voting begins, you have people going around saying, hey, are you free to go to the polls right now? I'll walk with you there. So campaigns take this very seriously. And I think that's really important, especially this works especially in a small state like Iowa, for example, because it's sort of easy to get around, easy to reach all of these voters.
This is the last chance I'll be able to ask both of you this before our November vote. So I got to put you on the spot. Elaine, your predictions. Who wins the House? Who wins the Senate?
Oh, boy. Okay. I think Democrats lose the House. I think that it would be pretty tough for them to hang on to all of these seats that are toss-ups in the House. And I think it's tough in the Senate. I think Democrats will maintain the Senate.
All right, David, you heard Democrats lose the House, keep the Senate. What do you think?
Well, considering Democrats have a majority in the House of roughly a handful of seats, Republicans don't even have to have a particularly good election day to win control of the House. And I think that's just what they're going to do. Whether they win by, 5 seats, 20 seats, 30 seats, that's still to be determined. But I think that they're on track to win the House because Democrats have simply too thin of a margin to protect. And so you'll see a House majority on Capitol Hill for the Republicans in January. The Senate is split 50-50. Democrats control the Senate because they've got the vice presidency and Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote. Republicans need to win one net seat. And given that the issue set favors Republicans, given that President Biden's approval ratings continue to be below 45% and somewhere between 40 and 45%, I think Republicans, one way or the other, are likely to get that one net seat they need to win the Senate majority. So it sets up an interesting contrast with divided government beginning next year between President Biden on the one hand and a Republican House and Senate on the other.
All right, so David, you're picking a Republican sweep of the two houses of Congress, and Elaine, you're slicing the baby down the middle, as we say. One House Republican, one House for the Democrats. All right, a month from now, we'll know the answer. Thank you very much, David Drucker, Elaine Godfrey. Appreciate having you back here on Dakhel, Washington. 32 years ago, when I was a doctoral student at Oxford University, I traveled to the Kingdom of Jordan to do field research for my dissertation on Jordanian political history. I interviewed numerous retired Jordanian officials, mined the Jordanian National Archives, and visited sites connected to my work. Along the way, I discovered that there was a special place at the University of Jordan, which housed all the books and files that the kingdom's leadership didn't want people to read. Books that ran counter to the official narrative of events, memoirs by now disgraced public officials, examples of rebellious or revolutionary pamphlets by government opponents. It was affectionately called the Forbidden Room, El Ghurfa El Mamnua. Thanks to liberal-minded officials in the royal palace, I was given access to the Forbidden Room. When I entered, I had the sort of exciting sensation that Eve must have had when she plucked the forbidden fruit from the banned tree in the Garden of Eden. And then, after spending some time looking around and seeing what was there, I realized there was less than meets the eye. The contents of the Forbidden Room contained few secrets, just books that I could find in other libraries if I looked hard enough. I don't know if the room still exists. I tell you this story as context for what is happening in various school libraries across America. The removal of books some activist parents believe are too provocative for their children, effectively creating forbidden rooms where open, accessible learning used to take place. According to the free speech advocacy group PEN, in just the past year, 1,586 different books were banned in 86 school districts in 26 states, affecting more than 2 million students in nearly 3,000 schools. These include some of the greatest works of modern literature, from To Kill a Mockingbird to The Great Gatsby to a graphic adaptation of The Diary of Anne Frank. Many of these books, but not all, touched on themes of race, sexuality, and gender, hot-button issues in the culture wars being fought across our country today. In Michigan, when a library refused instructions to take books off the shelves, the local government just defunded the entire library. Now, I welcome parental involvement in education. It's always good for parents to play a role in the vital part of rearing children. I'm an active parent after all. But in my view, trying to keep kids away from provocative, thought-provoking literature by banning books from libraries is the wrong way to teach kids about the themes in these books or to model responsible adult behavior. In an age when any kid with a cell phone can access truly objectionable material online, this is where parents draw the line? My gosh, we should be celebrating the idea that kids are reading real books and not just flipping through Instagram and TikTok. And furthermore, we should be encouraging kids to take on difficult, challenging, morally ambiguous literature, not least because we live in a difficult, challenging, morally ambiguous age. And that, in my view, is the sort of preparation that education should be all about. So please, no more forbidden zones, forbidden rooms, or forbidden books. Just more reading, more learning, and more books, please. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن دور البيت الأبيض في انتخابات الكونغرس الرئاسية والتشريعية، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.